Evening, everybody. My name's Councillor George Dunstall, and I am the chair of the Pensions Committee and Board. Can I introduce the committee members first, but also to say hello to the guests that have come this evening. So if I can ask committee members and officers to introduce themselves, starting to my left.
Cody Sprott, Principal Committee Coordinator.
Fiona Alderman, AD for Legal and Governance.
Diane Curran, Member for Woodside.
Mark White, Councillor for Tottenham Central.
John Bevan, Councillor, Northumberland Park.
Randy Plowright from Harringay Unison.
Jason Lycett, Assistant Director of Finance.
Alex Goddard, Investment Consultant from Mercer.
Ray Patterson, Employer Representative.
Keith Brown, Employer Representative.
I'm Raisin, Independent Advisor.
Rebecca Moore, Pensions Manager.
Tara News, Director of Finance.
Jamie Abbott, Head of Pensions.
Great, thank you, everyone. And could I just please ask everybody to switch their mobile phones off or onto silent to avoid any distractions. And only members of the public who have previously registered to speak are permitted to do so. And we welcome our registered speakers, and I'll come to you in a moment when it's time to speak. We'll move on to item 1, and that is filming at meetings. This meeting will be live streamed via the council's website and will also be recorded and available to view by members of the press and public. Everyone present is allowed to film so long as it doesn't disrupt the meeting. Thank you. Moving on to item 2. Apologies for absence or lateness or any substitutions. I've got apologies from Councillor Da Costa. Any other? Nobody? Nope, nothing is there. So thank you very much. Moving on to item 3, items of urgent business. No items of urgent business. Moving on to item 4 is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? No, thank you. There are none, but please let us know if you become aware of any during the meeting. And moving on to item 5, which is deputations, petitions and questions. So I'm pleased to welcome today a deputation from Grace Annesley, sitting opposite us, and she wishes to bring to our attention a matter regarding responsible investment, which is within the remit of this committee. And in a moment, I will ask you to press that red button. It's not a red button, is it? Press that button in a moment. And you will have 3 minutes to explain to the committee the purpose of your visit, and I'll let you know when you have 30 seconds remaining. After that, the committee will have the opportunity to ask any questions for you, and then I'll respond with my response, and I'll also provide a written response after this meeting. So if you are ready and happy, you can press the button and the 3 minutes will start.
Now, I'm here today representing pension members to urge Harringay. Oh. Wonderful. Right. Take 2. I'm here today representing pension members to urge Harringay Council to take decisive action, and that is to divest from companies involved in the unlawful occupation of Palestinian land and to divest from arms companies which are enabling the collective punishment of civilians in Gaza, actions which, according to the ICJ, plausibly constitute genocide. I'm going to spend my remaining time satisfying the 2-limb test, which is required to permit divestment for non-financial reasons. The first limb of this test requires trustees to have good reason to believe that pension members share the concern in question, and the evidence in support of this is overwhelming. There is consensus among this committee itself. So in July 2024, members of this committee said, and I quote, "Everybody around this table is in favour of what is being argued, that is divestment from the arms trade." The same sentiment was expressed 3 months prior in March 2024. Over the past 18 months, the Council has received 3 distinct petitions signed by a total of 2,737 residents calling for an immediate ceasefire and divestment. And this local activism aligns with broader public opinion. 56% of UK voters support a ban on arms exports to states engaged in human rights abuses, even where this weakens economic ties. The second limb of this test requires that divestment to not involve significant financial risk to the fund, and here the evidence is equally as compelling. Latest analysis by Morgan Stanley states that sustainable funds tend to outperform traditional ones by a median average of 4.7% over the past 5 years. And again, we do have available alternatives. So in July 2024, our advisor outlined that Legal & General offer a range of investment strategies, including index tracking funds that exclude armaments. I've done some really good research on this, which I'd like to go in detail in the Q&A section. And my second argument is that our current investment strategy actually harms the fund and taxpayers, and these are the reasons why. So, based on a FOI request from 2022, the council's budget was 1 billion that year, and council tax covered about 110 of that. The council contributed £29 million towards workers' pensions that year, and this was funded by both council tax and other sources. 29 million is roughly 26% of council tax income, which means potentially up to a quarter of council tax could be going towards pensions. You know, and this raises a key concern, which is that how wisely is this money being invested, given its significant impact on both pension members and on employees? I would actually make the argument that our current investment strategy
30 seconds.
directly undermines our services. So in 2023 alone, 20% of all visitors to the Haringey single homelessness pathway were from individuals fleeing war-torn countries. And again, this has a direct impact on the resources that we have, and therefore it highlights a contradiction which I hope we address today, which is that our pension investment should not fuel the very crisis that our services must then respond to and then pay for in council tax and exceptional funding. So my principal point is that it is unethical as well as doesn't make financial sense. Thank you.
Bang on 3 minutes, Grace. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for taking the time and for coming to see us this evening. Can I throw this open to the committee for any questions or queries?
Thanks, Chair. Sorry, did I hear right? You said you were here representing pension fund members. So could you just clarify a little bit how you're representing pension fund members and how that works? Thanks.
Yes, of course. So I kind of did 3 rounds of this. So the first was that I did a online kind of petition to collect names. I think there are 54 at the last count, but granted, the amount of progress that I could make was quite limited by the time that I applied to come here and not. Secondly, I then went round and also got signatures as well. And I'm also part of a network of people, which is growing really rapidly to make sure that, again, I think that all of us as those who are paying into the fund, and again, as our employer who's doing the same, that we really understand what we are invested in and make sure that aligns with on an individual basis, but I think also at an organisational level.
Thank you.
Any other questions or queries? I've got one. Yeah, I just wondered if you could speak a bit more to the point you made about Legal & General. I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that.
I'd love to. This was actually following the point that you raised in July 2024, which was that what we need is a viable ethical instrument that we can buy into, basically. I think that's a fair summary. So I met with a couple of colleagues, well, former colleagues that I have who work in private equity to get a bit of guidance on this, luckily for free. And what I basically did was I had a look at all of the available index funds under Legal & General, and I found 2, which I think are directly applicable to the issues here. And the first is the Legal & General Future World Global Equity Index Fund, bit of a tongue twister, and also the All World Equity Climate Multi-Factor Fund. But I have to caveat this a little bit because obviously Legal & General don't publicise their full portfolio, obviously for competitive reasons. So those are the 2 which I think align most clearly. But again, that is based on me as, you know, a kind of bog standard member trying to get the most amount of information possible. And what I hope to do in raising that is that, you know, everyone at this committee has far more clout and, you know, you have a mandate where I don't. And so I hope what this shows is that we do have the options available to us. And hopefully this starts the way for us actually to make some really decisive progress in this area. And one other point, I've reached out to various other local authorities that have accepted this. So I've spoken with Tower Hamlets, Avon County Council, so they manage Bristol's, and Waltham Forest. And as soon as I have that concrete information, I would love to pass that to the committee, because I think that's been the kind of key reason that we haven't made progress in this in the way that we want to.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or Councillor Income?
Yeah, no, thank you again for your deputation. I just wanted to ask, have you looked at what proportion of our fund do you think that is directly impacting on what's happening in Palestine and Gaza at the moment?
Do you mean in percentage terms or number terms?
In absolute and percentage terms.
Okay, so from what I can understand, there's a big part of it's about, I think we've got about 40%-ish in equity investments, so that's part of it. Yes, I was right. And also in monetary terms, we're talking about £39 million. So it's a lot of money.
Oh, thank you for that.
Councillor White?
Chair, I know this is supposed to be questions to the deputation, but I don't know if with your discretion, it might be possible to get the view of our advisors on the feasibility or of making the specific move that the deputation is suggesting, what the barriers might be to that, and you know, what else we need to take into consideration, how long that would take, etc.
Does anyone wish to speak to that?
So I'm certainly familiar with the Elgin Future World Fund. I've got quite a few clients that invest in that. That doesn't have blanket exclusions to companies of this nature. There is a version of the Future World Fund which follows the European Union's Paris-aligned benchmark designation, which does, as far as I'm aware, exclude all of the companies that tend to find themselves on these sort of lists, although it's not designed like that. So it's always possible that a company might be added to a UN list and be part of that fund. So I'm aware of other boroughs that are considering that. If you wanted to get an exact match to an exclusions list, then that would be much more complicated, because at the moment we're investors in pooled funds. You'd have to get a segregated account set up by Legal and General that had a specific list of exclusions. I have looked at this and the costs can be prohibitive as a proportion of the actual amount invested in these companies. So maybe the Paris-aligned version of Future World might be the best fit as opposed to Future World itself, which we could consider.
Thank you, Alex. Any other, and Keith?
Can I congratulate you on approaching this in such a professional way? This is really very refreshing for people to come. It's a serious issue and to actually think of proper ways of dealing with it. So that's thank you for that. There's unfortunately now a problem about armaments. Are we against armaments for Gaza but pro them for Ukraine? It's now a dilemma. It's one of the things, but I think we should have a look at the index. So thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions from the committee? Yes, John, Councillor Bowden.
Well, just to point out that we are at the moment reviewing how we allocate our investments with all the ESG and the issues that you've raised. So we have got a process which we're probably a third of the way through to address the issues that you've raised. But it is, I must confess, quite time consuming and complex, which I'm sure causes you concerns.
It's a little unorthodox, but I suppose we can take one question. Yeah.
And just the question on that was that, you know, I really want to kind of emphasize it's not at an individual level, or indeed on behalf of the kind of pension members that I represent. I understand the enormity of this task, right? It's deeply complex, as my research for this revealed, but also the other part is, I think, you know, I understand that we're looking at the way that we're reviewing kind of our investments as well, and I think it was the last pensions committee as well, there was discussions about a survey going on as part of that, and I just wondered if we'd made any kind of significant progress, because again, I think that would really aid the progress being made on this topic. And thanks for an unorthodox question.
So I'm happy to respond to that. I've got a detailed response here, but in short, one of the things that we'll be discussing tonight is the update on our responsible investment policy, which we've been working on for 9 or so months. And there'll be an update in there, and that is looking at things in the round in regard to ESG and how we approach that and how we want our investments to be reflective of our values. And we're doing that with some external support, but also as a committee more broadly. I don't know whether Karen or Jamie wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got a report, I think, coming up shortly on the agenda in terms of the responsible investment policy. I think the in terms of progress, you're correct. So we've had a couple of workshops with the committee in terms of just understanding priorities. That included a survey, which we're currently going through the analysis, but also looking at our investments against each of those priorities that was identified through the surveys and the workshops. We are slightly, I'm almost doing my update for the next agenda item. We are slightly behind schedule. I think we'd underestimated the task and how complex it was. Our original timetable was to be bringing the draft policy to this particular committee, but you'll see set out in the report that we are now aiming for the June committee, which is just the next cycle. So we're not. There are a couple of caveats to that, which I'll run through when we get to the agenda item in full. But you're absolutely right. The next paper sets out the timetable. So I think we're just over a third of the way through. I think we're almost closer to 2/3. So we're getting close to that point. We're just waiting for that analysis, and then we'll be able to have a session with committee members to start to draft that policy. But the feedback today and the discussion, and thank you for your deputation, has been really helpful in feeding into some of those thoughts that we'll be giving over the next few months. Thanks.
Not at all. I guess the other thing, just to add to that, to put on your radar if it isn't already, is around the Fit for the Future central government consultation that went in at the middle of January, and some concerns that we and other funds have had around a loss of potential autonomy about things around responsible investment and ESG. And that being taken away from us. So that's just something to put on your radar as well, to be aware of and to look into as well. I've got a response for you, which if you're happy, I will crack on with. I think some of it you may well already be aware of, but for the sake of kind of clarity, I'm going to provide it. So thank you very much for taking the time to make your deputation and to speak with us this evening. As you'll be aware, the Council is the administering authority of the Haringey Local Pension Scheme, and the PCB exercises that function under the Council's constitution. The PCB has a legal duty to manage the fund by investing in a diverse range of asset classes, including equities, bonds, property and infrastructure, in accordance with the investment strategy. This diversification aims to generate sufficient long-term returns, ensuring the fund can fulfil its obligations to pay members' pension benefits as they fall due. To fulfil this responsibility, the fund has, for several years, maintained a policy of investing passively in equity markets through pooled funds managed by external investment managers. This approach minimises investment costs while ensuring appropriate diversification for the fund. This means that the fund does not directly hold any shares in individual companies. Pooled funds aim to track the performance of a specific index following a rules-based approach established by the index provider. Consequently, pursuing exclusionary policies for individual companies or sectors is not feasible without incurring significant costs. Such actions risk financial detriment to the fund and could breach our fiduciary duty. As previously stated, the fund does not directly hold any shares in individual companies. However, it does have an exposure risk as a result of those tracker funds. All the fund's listed equities are invested through low carbon tracker funds, and this includes the RAFI Multi-Factor Climate Transition Fund, which aims for a 7% annual reduction in carbon intensity by 2050. As of 31st of December 2024, the fund's total investment portfolio was valued at approximately 1.93 billion. Of this total, the fund had about 0.02%, around £400,000, of indirect exposure to companies commonly identified through several freedom of information requests as being linked to the arms trade. So, for instance, BAE Systems, Elbit Systems, and so on. For the same reasons, it also has an exposure risk to companies listed by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. As of the 31st of December 2024, the fund had approximately 0.11%, or around 2.2 million, of indirect exposure to companies commonly identified by the OHCHR as conducting business activities in the occupied Palestinian territories. This consists of about 7 out of the 112 companies included on the list. The fund is committed to the responsible and sustainable investment of its assets. All appointed investment managers are required to be signatories of the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, and additionally, we request them to vote our shares in line with the local authority pension fund forum recommendations. LAPFA is an organisation representing 80 plus local government pension scheme funds and engages directly with companies on behalf of its member funds on a range of environmental, social and governance matters, including human rights and international law. The PCB continuously reviews the pension fund strategies and policies to ensure they are fit for purpose and align with the fund's long-term objectives. As a result of this ongoing review, we're currently developing the fund's responsible investment policy. A draft of this policy is expected to be completed by mid-2025, with implementation commencing in late 2025. The policy will need to comply with the Council's statutory obligations on investments and will establish a framework for approaching social, environmental and governance issues across all our investments, enabling us to respond consistently to ESG issues now and in the future. The policy will also take account, as appropriate, of the recent legal opinions of October 24 and January 25, received by the Scheme Advisory Board from Nigel Giffin KC. Additionally, we also plan to establish a governance framework to ensure our appointed investment managers are accountable based on specific criteria aligned with the fund's objectives. This work is also expected to be completed this year. So I want to thank you again for taking the time to come and speak with us. We're keen to maintain engagement with members and stakeholders on this in regard to all issues relevant to the PCB, but especially in regard to this one. And we know that people feel very strongly. So thank you again. All right. Should also add, you're very welcome to stay for the remainder of the meeting, should you wish to. Cool. Okay, thank you. Moving on to item 6, which is a record of training undertaken since the last meeting. Is there any training that anyone has to report?
I will send several in that I've done. I haven't done much.
Okay, fantastic. Item 7 is the minutes of the previous meeting, which have been circulated to members. Does anyone have any comments regarding the accuracy of the minutes? I had 1 point. Has that been reflected in that? Mm-hmm. Yep, fantastic. Thank you very much. Minutes are agreed. Item 8 is membership. The committee are asked to confirm the appointment of 2 employer reference members and 2 employee members for a 4-year term of office. And that is Randy Plowright, Keith Brown, Craig Pattinson, and we have a new member joining us for the next meeting, which will be Eamon Kenny. Everyone happy with that? Agreed? Item 9 is the responsible investment update, and this report updates Pensions Committee and Board on the fund's ongoing responsible investment development and the implementation work. Also provides an update on local authority pension fund forums, engagement and voting activities And Jamie, I will hand over to Jamie Abbott. Oh, hand over to Torrance, sorry.
Thank you, Chair, and builds from the earlier discussion. So this report presents an update on the timescales for the preparation of the responsible investment policy. Work started last July with an initial workshop, followed by further workshop sessions in September and October, which considered the priorities for the Pensions and Committee Board in this area. The original expectation is that we would be in a position to present a draft policy to committee today, but unfortunately there's been a delay. This is partly due to capacity within the team and change in personnel, but also the analysis that we are undertaking on the current investments against the feedback that we've received to date through those workshop sessions. This is now expected by the end of April. We are therefore anticipating that the draft policy will be presented to Pensions and Committee Board at the June meeting, and the revised timetable is presented on page 6 of your pack. There is one further development to highlight since the last update that we brought to the committee. So as you're all aware, the government launched a consultation called Fit for the Purpose on the future of local government pension scheme pooling, and Pensions and Committee Board did submit their response by the deadline in January. There were a number of different proposals within the consultation, including the increase in investments managed by pools, which for us is the London SIB. In relation to pension fund investment strategies, individual funds under the proposals, individual funds will still be responsible for preparing their strategies and for ours, the responsible investment policy, but pools could be responsible for their implementation if the proposals go ahead. We are still awaiting the outcome of the consultation, so at this stage the details remain unclear whether this will have an impact on the preparation of any of our responsible investment policy work, and therefore there was a suggestion that it would make sense for the fund to consider the implications and how the implementation of our policy will work in practice. We don't know the exact date of when the outcome of the consultation will be, but we do expect it to be fairly imminent. You can take imminent to interpret how you like. I think, you know, the word on the street is it's fairly soon. So I think it would be really beneficial for, as part of our work, to also take account of the outcome of the consultation. Thank you, Chair, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Questions for Councillor Bevan?
Well, one minor question. The LAP emails that they send out go to all the committee. Can I ask the 4 members who are not councillors whether you get the LAP regular emails? Because if you don't, I think somebody should add their email addresses to the LAP database.
Does anyone not get the email updates? And if you don't, I'll put your name down.
Any other questions or comments on the?
Thanks. Just on the delay. Obviously, with Tim leaving, there's been unavoidable disruption to the team, but I understand that a large part of the delay is comes on the side of our partners. And how are we going to ensure that they do things on the time that, because we've agreed a timetable with them and they haven't managed to stick to it. So how are we going to kind of hold their feet to the fire and avoid any further delay from their side?
Yeah, thank you. And some of the delay, particularly before Christmas, was us just putting in place the permissions for them to allow for them to have access to the data and the granularity of the data that was needed. So we have to accept some responsibility on our part, particularly before Christmas as well. We did go quiet over that Christmas period. We're now much more actively engaging with them. So Jamie, colleague to my left, we're having those regular updates. We are told that analysis will be with us by the end of April. Is that correct? Yeah, sometime in April. So we're anticipating holding the next workshop with committee members by the end of April once we have that information.
Do we have a date in the diary for that yet?
Not yet, but we're checking availability. It will be between the 22nd and 24th of April.
Sorry, go on, Craig.
Does the representation here this evening, would that fall within the realm of the policy review? So in the topic of discussion that was raised, would that be covered under the investment policy that is being crafted?
So, so the first stage of the development of the policy was for through the workshop was to identify priorities in terms of investment. So it won't feature as exactly how it's been presented this evening, but all of that feedback and that consideration of, I suppose, all the deputations and all the feedback that we've received over the last year will need to come into, we'll need to consider as part of the priorities for Pensions Committee and Board when in developing that responsible investment policy.
Is divestment part of what's being considered?
It's not been explicitly considered to date. I do think the next workshop that we're holding towards the end of April is going to be quite crucial because it will provide us with the more granular detail about where our investments are at the moment. So that could well be a topic of conversation at the next workshop, but it hasn't, I've only been involved in one workshop. It hasn't been explicitly a topic of discussion to date.
Okay, I'm not a lawyer, but I know on that particular area, there's very strict law around it. So we have to make sure that we're properly advised. I'm not sure how to phrase this, but if we talk the topics that are raised this evening, it's not the first time it's been raised. And everyone have different views, but I'm conscious that we're only ever hearing the perspective from one side, for lack of a term. And if we're going to address it, I don't know if this is done, but should we be inviting another perspective? If we're about to start making decisions about investments and it's only informed by one perspective, is that responsible? And should we be allowing or inviting others to come and give their perspective?
I mean, I'm happy to respond to that. I think that the point of the responsible investment work for us is to consider the ESG in the widest possible context. So the conversations that we have had have revolved around understanding, firstly, what our exposure to all sorts of issues are, and secondly, what our tolerance, I suppose, for some of that is. And we've been talking about everything, including, you know, workers' rights, labour force issues, and supply chains, and much more broad than maybe just the very specific issues that have been brought to this committee for exactly that reason. And I think what we want to try and get to is a framework for decision making that sort of reflects the values that we have, whilst not undermining our duties as a administering authority. Does that respond to some of that? I'm very happy to invite alternative views on things. These have come to us as opposed to us inviting them, obviously. But Matt.
Thanks, Chair. So it strikes me from what you've raised, Craig, you said we should be inviting different perspectives. I mean, deputations are generally not invited. They're people that bring their views. But we have had different perspectives, because I don't think you're likely to get a kind of directly opposing perspective where you'll get somebody who'll say, oh, well, you should be actively investing in this stuff. But what we have had previously, and I think it was before you were a member, we had a series of deputations who were asking us to focus on not investing in fossil fuels, particularly. And we took that on board, and we took that perspective on board. Now we're getting a different perspective coming to us. So I suppose all we can do is take on board the perspectives that are brought to us The process that we're going through now, though, I don't think when you're saying is divestment a part of that policy, is the process not more that we're trying to find out what ethical criteria we want to be using to inform our investment policy, and then once that's complete, we can then take a look at our investments and decide whether that some of those investments might not be in accordance with that policy that's been built on the basis of what members of this committee or the decision-making committee feel. But obviously that's informed also by people who bring their variety of varying perspectives to the committee. But I'm not sure if it makes sense to invite a deputation. But anyway, I mean, feel free to do so if you want to.
Any other questions or queries, Keith?
I think the armaments question has been changed dramatically by the issues over at Ukraine. So I'm not sure that's going to come up again. And I think you have to be, I mean, doing it this way is really quite professional and sensible, and you can really engage with that. I just don't think that's going to be an issue for us to face. The issues we're going to have to really concentrate on in the next year or two are how much the government wants to intervene with pension allocation of pension fund money, and that may need to be a bigger focus for us in the next coming year.
Thank you. Any other questions or? Sorry, go on, Keith. Go on.
I also think if we've got anything unethical now, the number, I was impressed by the numbers in terms of the marketing equity. It's in the private equity that we need to look at, to have an examination of that.
I mean, I'd agree with Keith that everyone concentrates on listed equity. You know, there's not a lot of concentration on illiquid and private assets, and you know, you'll have no influence there actually. Tell me when I go wrong here, Alec, but you know, if you invest into, you know, a so-called infrastructure fund, which is, you know, aka private equity sometimes, they'll decide for you what they invest in, and they'll tell you when they've invested because it's all commercially confidential and secret beforehand. So there's much more, I think, questions need to be asked before you enter into that sort of thing, because that's where you could get, you know, quite a big exposure and a direct exposure, and perhaps someone might come and sit there and really have a, you know, say, well, what have you been doing here? So I think you're right. That's the sort of thing that you really could get caught out. I don't think anyone has got caught out. I don't think anyone's cottoned on to this yet, but someone's going to cotton on pretty soon, eventually, somewhere. What are people doing in illiquid assets? What sort of safeguards are we asking for? And I think this will become particularly, you know, as Pauline takes off with, for example, the CIV, you know, what things do we not want, you know, a private equity stroke infrastructure vehicle? Because a lot of private equity is badged as infrastructure. You know, what do we not want and we're not wanting to invest in? You know, you might want to invest us in university accommodation, etc. But you might not want to invest in, you know, certain aspects of health, stroke social care, because, you know, it could be with some private equity company who's charging councils an absolute fortune. Yeah. So you raise an extremely good point. And actually, but that's where I think in the future, you know, a fund somewhere in the country could get caught out.
I think that was much more clearly articulated, but where I was trying to get to with my inquiry about the health investments of CBRE. But Councillor Income.
Not a question, just maybe a comment. It's interesting that what we felt was potentially our exposure to companies directly involved in the Middle East conflict was quite small in comparison to what the answer was given, right? So you said, what is it, 2.5 million maybe at worst, right? But they had a completely different take, which was 39 million. And I think this is the other challenge, right? That we're all going to have quite a different view about which companies are exposed, right?
Well, and I think that fundamentally that's why we need to approach this in the way that we are, which is about a framework approach of understanding what we are trying to achieve and making decisions based within that. But John.
I just want to clarify something I just said. I'm not suggesting that any illiquid investment is going to go into an arms trade, but I'll give you an example. You might go into a private equity stroke infrastructure fund that invests in airports, and you might have a particular view or might not have a view on airports. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about. And, you could easily go into a private equity stroke infrastructure fund and find that you've got some airports. Now, you might think that's fine, or you might think, That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. Not, really nasty things, but things which some people would find very disagreeable.
Absolutely.
So just to check then, on the based on what John's just said about illiquid assets, are we able to build any safeguards into our ethical investment policy relating to maybe that's a question for John.
I do think, and please, Alex, tell me if I go wrong here, that given that we may be moving to a position where the board will have a lot more influence over us, particularly on the execution of investment strategy, but also potentially on the creation of it, that we should be specifying sooner rather than later the things that we believe or don't believe. And for example, if members, and I'm not suggesting members, what members believe is what you believe, but let's say that members, particularly disliked airports and didn't think there should be any more, then we should be saying that. Or is there something else in those sort of investments that you don't particularly like? If you didn't like, I don't know, gas pipelines in the US or something. If someone has a particular issue with those and could justify it, etc., then we should be saying it. I think. In the RI policy, I'm not saying that's what we should be doing, but it's that area, and I think Keith's right, where so far no one has really looked in terms of representation from groups. But if somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, "How could we go and challenge a fund?" I might say, "Well, start asking questions about these sort of things."
Thank you. Any other questions or comments on item 9? I've got one. Nobody else does, which just with regard, this new timeline still feels challenging. Not a question so much as a comment. Yeah, just I'm aware that we're racing towards April, but.
And comment accepted. And I think we need to aim for June. I've been honest with you this evening about why we haven't met the timescales now. I think we should at least have that ambition. My worry is that if we need to slip it further, then we need to have a really good reason, as opposed to just giving us a bit more time. I mean, I hope that once we receive the information back and we can get together with the committee and board in April, it can move at a much faster pace. So I would like us to still have that aim, but yeah.
Okay, great. Ready to move on? Move on to item 10, which is the Pensions Administration update. This provides the committee with the following updates regarding the pension fund's administration activities. So we've got a pension fund membership update, online member self-service update, service level agreement statistics, dashboard update, pension fund audit, and the independent advisors update. And I'll hand over to Rebecca to introduce this report.
Thank you, Chair. So starting with the membership update, there's been a spike in active members due to Fusion coming in-house. A steady rise for both pensioners and deferred members, no massive changes there. Moving on to the online member self-service portal update. Active MSS registrations are starting to stagnate. However, we're looking to do more comms, especially with the annual benefit statements coming up. Publishing the active annual benefit statements to the member self-service should increase the registration numbers. Moving on to the SLA service level agreement statistics. Overall, the SLAs remain positive across most case types, high 80s into 90%. There is a continual work on transfer casework, which is evidenced in the SLA increase. There is a slight drop in retirement quotes and actuals due to the increase in this casework. Moving on to the pensions dashboard project update. If you refer to paragraph 6.11, the Haringey Pension Fund have appointed Hayward Pension Technologies to be the integrated service provider, which sits between the pension fund and the pension dashboard environment for the pensions dashboard project. This will commence in April 25 and will last 12 weeks. Update on the wider pension dashboard project is on the 8th of January 2025. The Pensions Dashboard Programme published a blog on the draft reporting standards. Reporting standards cover the service availability, coverages, view responses. The blog confirms the final standards will be published in Q1 of 2025. They were published on the 13th of March, and the pensions team are reviewing the standards and will update the dashboard project plan accordingly and will provide an update to the PCB at the next meeting. Moving on to the update of the 23-24 pension fund audit. The pension fund accounts for 23-24 was signed by the Section 151 officer and chair of the PCB in time to meet the 28th February 2025 backstop date. The full KPMG audit report can be seen in Appendix 1 for full comments. Independent advisors LGPS update. Paragraph 6.18 to 6.21 is a summarised version of the independent advisors LGPS update, and the full version can be found in Appendix 2, and I will pass that over to John Raisin. Thank you.
Sorry, John, before you jump in, are there any questions on what Rebecca's covered before John gives his update? I read there quite a lot covered.
Well, there's just a comment at 621 that implies that certain pension committees in certain councils are struggling because the councils are not providing adequate resource, when in fact that resource doesn't come from the council, it's paid for by the pension fund. So I'm just asking, is that happening here? Are we struggling because the council is not delivering on, we're not paying for what we need?
I think that's probably most appropriate for me to answer. So Jamie recently took up the position of head of pensions. We are actively looking at the structure in the pensions team and the capacity. So I won't go into too much detail, but Jamie and I are certainly having that review. There is an awful lot going on in the world of pensions over the next 12 months, and we've noted that. And to be able to keep on top of that, we are talking about capacity, and in addition, a couple maybe of additional roles that we may need to create, particularly, as I say, I think over the next 12 to 24 months. I would agree, they're not funded by the council. There is no cost subsidising. It's fully funded by the pension fund. That isn't a reason for us not to challenge ourselves and make sure we're getting value for money. But equally, there is a lot, and I think when we get on some of the other agenda items as we go through, there is an awful lot, I think, for us to do in the pension space and to bring back to this committee and board. So Jamie and I are very actively talking about the capacity and any gaps that we've got in the team at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, my update just covers 4 issues really. First one is a consultation. Taryn's already sort of hinted at, what might come out of that, but an interesting thing in the consultation was 2026 is the date for the new regime, according to the consultation. But part of that regime, remember we said, is that the government wants the pools to have a lot more influence, particularly not only in implementation, but also in terms of investment strategy. But that wasn't a free ride for the pools, because if you read the consultation as well, the government wants to have a lot more overview, scrutiny, and essentially, in the end, control of the pools. So it's not a free ride for the pools. And the pools were encouraged to think about their futures. And it actually said in the consultation, we like less pools. Well, that hasn't come about because all 8 pools have said we want to continue. Now, the government's also said they won't force by legislation amalgamation. So this creates a difficulty. I understand there are discussions this week, next week between ministers and pools, but at this point, there's still potentially 8. Now 3 are not FCA regulated. They all want to be. It doesn't mean the ones that aren't FCA regulated don't have questions to answer as well. Both sides do. So it's difficult. So, I think my message would be, I can't see 2026 being the implementation of this new regime. It just seems very unlikely. But, I think we will get a response back on the consultation, but whether that actually means they can implement everything by 2026 or what they'll say is another matter. Because even if they don't back down, I just can't see how they can do it by 2026, particularly given that pools are not, voluntarily wanting to amalgamate any of them at this point. Second thing is a bit of good news. Accounts and audit, you remember since 2022, the Scheme Advisory Board has been saying, please separate out the accounts from the Administration Authority and the actual pension fund. As I did the council accounts, pension fund accounts. Finally, in December, as part of a wider audit consultation, the government has said that they're minded to do this. We await the final response of the government, and hopefully they'll do it. Because in Scotland and Wales, of course, pension fund things have been signed off by December in almost all cases, and it's a lot easier world. So hopefully that's good news. Funding strategy statement, as you know, that is a document that goes alongside the actuarial evaluation. It goes alongside a lot more than that, but that's the primary time when it's updated. Last time the guidance on this was issued was 2016. Well, 2016 was a very different world. There's been a number of changes that I've highlighted in here. For example, you can now have an exit credit when an employer leaves. You can now have a deferred debt arrangement. So all of those aren't covered. But more particularly, I think, is that there's been a wide variety of approaches by administrative authorities to employers. Some administrative authorities have been very good at consulting employers and genuinely engaged them. Others, quite frankly, have been less so. So this encourages more engagement, but it also encourages funds, which I think was a weakness in the past, of being upfront with employers and saying to employers, yes, this is up for discussion, but actually this isn't. So again, they're asking for more sort of clarity. So I think it's, the new guidance is very, very good. And the final thing I draw to your attention is this Scheme Advisory Board, a letter from Councillor Roger Phillips to all Section 151 officers and chairs of pension committees. And essentially, it comes back to what you very helpfully raised, just about resourcing. What Councillor Phillips is basically saying in his letter is pension fund is separate from the Administration Authority. It refers to the fact that government wants to implement a good governance review, which talked about proper resourcing, etc. And he's just making an appeal, do not mix up the council and the pension fund. He also raises a number of other issues in that letter. The need to retain staff, a big issue, and about failure to adequately resource. And I don't think this is an issue for Haringey at all, but he reminds you could be censored by TPR. There could be findings against you by the pensions ombudsman. You could have incomplete data, which could lead to higher employer contributions and poor service to employers and employees. I don't think that applies at all here, but he's writing to 86. The other thing I just add is that in relation to Councillor Phillips' letter, I think there's some good answers to that in the later officer report on the good governance review that I did and their response to it. I'll stop there.
Any questions or comments for John? No? Okay, we'll move to the recommendations set out at page 9, paragraph 3.1, and this report is to be noted. Moving on to item 11, which is the risk register. This paper has been prepared to update the Pensions Committee and Board on the Pension Fund's risk register and provide an opportunity for the Pensions Committee and Board to further review the risk score allocation. And I will hand over to Jamie to provide us with an update.
Thank you, Chair. So for this update, we'll be focusing on the administrative risks. So I draw members' attention to section 6.6 and table 1, the key risks. So you'll notice that The risk, which was in relation to the sign-off of the accounts for 22-23, has been removed as they have been signed off by the backstop date. Yeah. There we go. Excellent. Sorry, yeah. So the risk around the sign off of the accounts have been removed because we signed them off within the backstop date, and that has been replaced by a new risk, IMV9, which is the proposed changes to the LGPS pooling, which we touched upon by Tyron earlier. Basically, there's an unknown about what the contestation response will be. We have a rough idea, but we can't speculate. So the MHCLG is expected to issue a response to the contestation fit for the future in the first half of 2025. So in preparation, the officers in consultation with their advisors are to consider the implementation requirements once the consultation response is released, and then we'll know better how that impacts the investments and the reporting requirements, and we'll feed that back to the PCB. The other two key risks, IMV1 and IMV3, are unchanged. There's an additional part to IMV3, which is, again, Tyron touched upon earlier, that the first series of workshops were conducted for the investment policy, September, October 24, and we're looking to have B Finance come in again in late April to present to the PCB in the investment working group to analyse the beliefs that we drew up and how that compares to our current fund managers, and to help draft the policy, which will be released in late 2025. The administration risks remain unchanged apart from one key addition, which is AD7. That's on page 37. So AD7 is a new risk that we identified, and that is the increase in regulatory changes that have been happening over a short period of time leads to a spike in work volume and potential of incorrect adaptation or compliance of those changes and the complex nature of those. So the team are attending enrolled in professional forums to idea share to mitigate those risks, and their support provided by the LGA and the actuary when necessary, and our independent advisors. And we'll feed back to the committee and board if there's any issues around the compliance of new changes. And that's it. I'll take questions on the risk register.
Do you committee members have any questions, Matt?
I've just got one, which is on risk GOV1, which is on at the top of page 31, which has just been, it's been there for a long time, and it's lower rated than it was when I first became a councillor in 2018. We've been quite successful in recent years in keeping the membership of the committee fairly steady. But I wonder if it might be worth, on round about this time of year, every year, just writing a kind of reminder note to the chief whips of the two political groups that send members to this committee, that there's been a previous commitment to do everything that they can to keep the membership as steady as possible, and that not doing so is a risk to the pension fund. So just a kind of regular reminder, because I don't know if that necessarily happens, and you never know. Change of personnel in the different positions, people don't. There's the institutional memory of that commitment may be lost.
I think that's probably more a question for Councillor Dunstall.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and one that I'm happy to take away and do. Any other questions or queries from committee members on the risk register? No. Fantastic. In which case we'll move to the recommendations as set out at page 27, paragraph 3.1, and that report was also to be noted. Moving on to item 12, this is the Pension Fund Quarterly Investment and Performance Update, providing the Pensions Committee and Board with following updates regarding performance, overview of fund performance, including funding position, independent advisors commentary, investment manager performance and asset allocation. And I'll hand back to Jamie to introduce this report.
Yeah. So we're looking at the fund performance of up to quarter ending 31st of December 2024. So start with section 6.1, which shows the fund investment portfolio as at December 2024, which is £1.93 billion, which is a 0.5% increase over the quarter. And chart 1 there shows the past 5 years performance of the fund portfolio. On 6.2, chart 2 shows the fund investment portfolio over the various time periods, and it compares the actual to the benchmark. The fund was in line with the strategic benchmark over the last quarter. However, over the previous time periods, it had been below. Moving on to the funding position updates. So on Appendix 2, you will find the Hyman Robertson's, the fund actuaries indicative funding position and the latest actuarial assumptions. That's in the exempt part of the agenda. So I won't comment on that. So just comment 6.7, so the fund assets have kind of increased modestly over since the last valuation. However, the present value of future liabilities has decreased significantly, resulting in notable improvement to the funding level. Section 6.8 to 6.14 is a summarized version of the market commentary made by the independent advisor, John Raisin, and I'll pass over to John to introduce that.
First of all, it's changed a bit since then. I was going to very briefly comment on that. I mean, yeah, from that report, I mean, American markets are holding the world up in the equity markets in the final quarter of last year, or the third quarter of our financial year. And Mr. Trump's re-election appeared to bolster markets initially. US markets thought, oh yeah, yes, deregulation and etc. etc. The rest of the world was fearful. Tariffs, extra difficulties. So initially, after he came in, everything went up in the US, and everything went down. This is in listed equities everywhere else. Although that did temper a bit in December, because the Federal Reserve, which of course is a very sensible body, a central bank, headed by a very, I think, robust and independent head, Jay Powell, indicated they were going to sort of mitigate their reductions in interest rates because of economic data coming forward. So there was a bit of a pull off in December. Everywhere else was down because essentially there were problems elsewhere. Europe had real problems, real economic difficulties on the horizon, political instability in France, which I'll talk about there. But of course things have changed since then. January, I think things started to go up, and February and March they've unwound. I suppose when you're in a world where you have a 200% tariff 1 minute and it's taken off the next, and all sorts of other things that people can't get their heads around, it makes for a very difficult world. It's interesting, there's some little charts in the FT, which Keith will know every day, that show how markets have moved over the last 3 months. It's interesting, in equity markets, US is down, but Europe is up. One of the issues in Europe, of course, kicking their economy now is, ironically, Mr. Trump's attitude towards Ukraine, which has really sort of pushed some sort of, economic potential revival, or people think there might be in Europe because of this, needing to look after Europe's own defence. UK is up as well, but UK is very cheap. I mean, UK is historically so cheap, and all other markets are, emerging markets are cheap, Europe's cheap, UK is cheap. The only one that's expensive, and it's horribly expensive, is US. And most of the US, of course, has been driven, as we know, by, it's actually 10 companies, I think. There's 7 plus there's 3 others, 3 or 4, one of which is JP Morgan, actually. But that's all coming off now, and it was bound to come off eventually. I just think perhaps that, I don't know, Mr. Musk has, precipitated that rather faster than it might otherwise have happened. That's just my thought on the world. I'm happy to keep quiet now.
Thank you very much, John. Insightful as ever. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Jamie or John on that Councillor Ingram.
I don't know whether this is the right time to ask, but given these uncertainties now, and it's a start of a 4-year term, what do you all feel in terms of our long-term, our investment strategy and how much exposure we have to this level of uncertainty going forward? And should we be reconsidering some of our investments?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what I would say is you've taken steps over the past few years to diversify some of your risks, so you're not as reliant on equity markets. So you've only got 40% in equities, for example, whereas some other LGPS funds will have materially more than that. I think also when you go through periods of market volatility like we're going through at the moment, it does stress some of the benefits of having those diversifying allocations. So Ruffer, who I know are a manager that have come up at committee meetings regularly because of disappointing performance over the past couple of years, they're actually up by about 5.5% in 2025, performing exactly as you would expect when you see weakness in equity markets. That said, as we go through the actuarial valuation, we will want to review investment strategy alongside that, particularly bearing in mind the size of the surplus that we are currently showing based on the Hyman's analysis. So I think absolutely the level of risk that we're running will be something that we want to consider. But we are long-term investors, and so there will continue to be a role for equity investment for us for a long time, I suspect.
Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Nope. In which case we'll move to the recommendations set out at page 39, paragraph 3.1. This report is to be noted. Moving on to item 13, which is the forward plan, and this paper is being prepared to identify and agree upon the key priorities for the Pensions Committee and Board over the upcoming months, as well as seek the PCB's input into future agendas. And I will hand over to Jamie again to introduce this report.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to highlight section 6.4, which is table 1, and that outline the key priorities added to the proposed work plan for the next 9 to 12 months. So as previously touched upon, the setting of the responsible investment objectives has been pushed back slightly to June 2025. And we're still currently developing the framework around that and how that looks with B Finance. The investment opportunity review, which was in the last PCB about the private markets allocation, again has been moved to June 2025. And the pension fund business plan, which is part of the governance review work, has been scheduled for June 2025. So that's the forward plan. Is there any question on the fund key priorities before I move on to the knowledge and skills?
I had one clarification, if that's right. So within this, so we've got on page 6, much earlier, we've got approval of the policy, RI policy in June. On here, we've got June. In the appendix, we've got responsible investment development going on until December. And I just wondered what that meant.
Okay. Oh, yeah, so basically, so thank you. Basically, yeah, so it goes on to December because we're meeting in April to look at the key beliefs and how that ties in with our current fund managers. And then once we've had that meeting and agreed the beliefs and how we want the policy to be, we will then be drafting it. So it could lead on to September, maybe not December, but definitely would be finalized by June. We're looking at maybe mid to late 2025. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Any other questions from the committee before Jamie moves on? John?
It's just an idea. I don't know if it's appropriate. I think it was mentioned somewhere that perhaps we should try and get a member on the LAP executive. I'm aware that if you want to do that, you have to get approval from your pension committee to go forward. Perhaps we should have it somewhere in one of these dates to ask, does anyone want to go for the LAP executive elections? And if they do, then the committee can say, we agree with this person, or it's just an idea.
Yeah, I don't know. That sounds positive to me.
Yeah, I suppose I don't know the process that we need to go through. So can we perhaps go away and just, if there's a general appetite that that's the direction of travel, if we just go away as an officers and work out whether there's a process of nominations, etc., that we need to follow. Thanks.
Yeah, the councillor from Camden, she gets approval from her pension committee. So if no one wants to put themselves forward, then we just don't do anything.
I should note, I don't know, because LAPF is obviously a national thing. There are quite a few London members on that executive already, unless that's changed recently. I think there's one from Ealing, one from Newham, one from Hackney. So I don't know how easy it would be to get someone from Haringey on there, but maybe it's worth looking into the process. Yeah.
Yeah, leave that with us. We'll do a bit of investigating, get a bit of background and bring a further update back. Thanks.
Thank you. I just move on to the knowledge and skills. Just want to remind members, section 6.7 about the LOLA, the LGPS Online Learning Academy, which is facilitated by Hyman Robertson. If you haven't accessed it yet, please do. It's a very useful tool to learn and resource on. And then lastly, 6.8 table 2, highlight the responsible investment workshop around the health check, which Q2 2025, we're expecting to kick that off and previously mentioned.
Great. Any further questions from the committee on this? Nope. So we'll move to the recommendations as set out at page 49, paragraph 3.1, and this report is also to be noted. Moving on to item 14, which is the governance review implementation plan. This paper has been prepared to outline the proposed implementation of the fund's governance review recommendations following the review undertaken by the fund's independent advisor. Officers welcome comment from the Pensions Committee and Board on the content and timeframe, and I will hand over to Taryn to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. So as Pensions Committee and Board will be aware, last year we asked John Raisin, our independent advisor, to undertake a governance review of the fund. And back in the January meeting, we presented a high-level summary of the findings with a commitment to come back to update at this meeting on an action plan and timetable for implementation of the recommendations. The 26 recommendations varied in terms of their nature and the timescales to delivery, and as set out on page 55 of the report back tonight, have been allocated into 3 categories. Those recommendations that are considered fundamental and urgent, those that are easily implementable, and those that will be implemented during 25-26. And the business plan, which we bring back to you to hopefully the June meeting, will set out the delivery of those in more detail, because some of them will take a significant level of resource for the pensions team, which we've already touched on in an earlier item. So we will want to be prioritising those on the basis of risk. So our current focus is on those that are in categories 1 and 2, and 3 of the easily implementable recommendations have already been completed. Full details are set out in the appendix to the report on pages 57 to 59. This also provides details of when or indications of when we're intending to bring back various suggested policies and documents during the course of the year, which were recommended as part of the review. For me personally, the need for Pensions Committee and Board to have an agreed business plan for the year and a plan for the medium term is the most critical, and which will include a budget and forecast for the year. And the priority really is to bring this to the committee first. In future years, we'll want to be working towards having this business plan at the March meeting, so as we are tonight, so that you are approving that business plan before the year starts. So I'm happy, the detail is set out in the appendix of all 26 recommendations. I'm happy to take any questions, but equally, we do have John Mason here tonight who carried out the review, who you may also want to ask questions of him too. Thanks.
Do committee members have any questions? Councillor Ingram.
Yeah, no, thank you for this. My question is about the timelines under the fundamental and urgent, so numbers 6 to 13. There's obviously zero progress in all of these, and then you've got a start and end date. I think it looks to me very tight. How realistic is this timeline in terms of delivering or getting some progress on these recommendations?
Are you referring to the start and end date quoted?
Yes.
So the work will start before the start date quoted. That's just more the PCB month we're aiming for. So we're not expecting to do all the work within 1 month. We're going to start it before then, and that's the completion timeline, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, because I was just thinking, how are you going to deliver all of this in 1 month? But do you think the end date is realistic though? Because you're talking about July and then September, isn't it? To realistically deliver on all of these recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, as highlighted, I do think the business plan is a real priority. And I know the item before we touched on the forward plan, what the business plan will do will be just really digging into that in a bit more detail and putting some realistic timescales. Not all of them. So the business plan is quite a fundamental piece of work. There are other items or other line items that won't be so intense. And I was going to echo what Jamie said actually. So for example, the business plan, we should almost be starting it tomorrow, as opposed to what this is saying is on the 1st of July. Not all of them will be really intense. So I do think the business plan is going to be really resource intensive. There are other areas that won't. So again, we should, particularly given that they're been highlighted as fundamental and urgent, I think we should be working on kind of bringing them as soon as possible. Some of them, if I could just give an example, like number 12. We have a risk register that we've gone through tonight. That particular recommendation is almost just the recategorization of risk, which is, shouldn't say in front of Jamie, is a quick and easier piece of work, but it's probably nowhere near as resource intensive as the business plan. So I think we've got a sense of realism. What I would say is, on the implemented in 25-26, those are the ones that we as part of the business plan, we really do need to take a step back and say which ones are most important. And I'm happy to be open and transparent. There may well be a few of those that slip through to 26-27, but our commitment is that we will do it on a risk-based approach, so that we make sure there's a couple of policy documents that I would say that and communications which we touched on that I think are really key at the moment, whereas there will be some other items on that list that we could slip, or we could afford to slip, from 20 to 26-27. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Any further questions or queries from the committee? No. Okay. We'll move to the recommendations as set out at page 55, paragraph 3.1, and this report is to be noted. Item 15 is items of urgent business. Are there any items of urgent business? No, there are none. We'll move to the next one. Item 16 is dates for the future meetings, and these are TBC. So hold all the evenings in the next 3 months from now. Item 17 is exclusion of the press and public. Items 18 and 19 are likely to be subject to a motion to exclude the press and public from the meeting, as they contain exempt information as defined in section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972, as amended by section 12A of the Local Government Act 1985. Paragraph 3, namely information relating to the financial or business affairs of any particular person, including the authority holding that information, and paragraph 5, information in respect of which a claim to legal professional privilege could be maintained in legal proceedings. So we will end